Russia is moving towards widening its nuclear deterrence norms. Russian President Vladimir Putin laid out the planned changes to Russia's nuclear doctrine. Russia will now have a broader list of countries and military alliances whose neutralization will require nuclear deterrence. And of all the points, this is one which stood out the most among Western nations. At least it got their attention immediately. And I'm going to quote from this: aggression against Russia by a non-nuclear country, but with the participation or support of a nuclear country, is proposed to be viewed as their joint attack on Russia, quote unquote. Now, this news has been registered deeply in Ukraine and, of course, in Western countries as well. Welcome to Game Plan. I'm Shivan Chanana, and I'll discuss this further with Ben Aris, who's the founder and editor-in-chief of BNE IntelliNews and also former Moscow bureau chief for the Daily Telegraph. Ben, thank you for joining me on Game Plan. Always a pleasure speaking with you. Ben, the proposed revised nuclear doctrine, and it has a broader list of countries that are subject to nuclear deterrence now. Is it time the West paid more heed to Russia's warnings?
Well, there's a lot to unpack here. We should start by saying the nuclear doctrine allows Russia to use its nuclear weapons in a first strike if there is, quote unquote, an existential threat to Russia. What that exactly means, you can interpret in many ways, but, it's taken to mean that, in practical terms, if Russia is losing the war in Ukraine and Ukraine has invaded Russia, that would be an existential threat to the Russian sovereignty, and so it would be allowed to use a nuclear weapon in that fight. In terms of the changes, what they've done is broadened it. Obviously, it now implies that Russia is allowed to take an attack by Ukraine, which is not a nuclear power, as a joint attack by Ukraine and America, and therefore use nuclear weapons against Ukraine, justified by the fact that the States has nuclear weapons and it's their partner. But however, look, this is part of Putin's strategy, and there's two parts to these changes. There's the threat of use of nuclear weapons, and then there's the actual chance that they will use nuclear weapons. And those are two entirely different things. Just the threat is very useful because, as we've seen, Zelensky's in New York at the moment. He's asking Biden for a lot more weapons in order that, he can turn the tide of the war and win. And Biden is flatly refusing to do that, and specifically refusing to give permission to allow Ukraine to use its long-range missiles, Western supplied, to hit targets in Russia, because the States is afraid that will be construed as an attack on Russia by America and spark World War III. And just the threat that Putin may use nuclear weapons has caused this caution. If Russia didn't have nuclear weapons, I'm pretty sure that the States would arm Ukraine to win this war. But because it's threatening to use nuclear weapons, it's held back. It's given Ukraine enough so that it doesn't lose, but not enough so that it wins. And look at the situation in the Middle East with Israel. It's fighting against Lebanon. Lebanon doesn't have any nuclear weapons, and American F-16s are flying alongside Israeli F-16s and shooting down missiles. They're actively participating, whereas there's not a single US soldier on the ground in Ukraine, as far as we know, because of this threat. As for the actual use of nuclear weapons, I think that's highly unlikely, although it's non-zero. For several reasons. There's the historical legacy that Putin doesn't want to be seen as someone who used nuclear weapons against civilians. There's also the response that it would trigger, that it would probably bring NATO into the war in Ukraine, although they would probably hit back with extreme conventional weapons, because again, no one wants a nuclear exchange. And finally, the Chinese would not allow it, in so much as it would then completely isolate Russia. China would have to reject the use of nuclear weapons, and that would leave China on its own, and it actually finds Russia a very useful partner in this sort of deadlock sanctions regime, which China is suffering from as well. So the actual use of even a small tactical nuclear weapon is highly unlikely for all those reasons. But as I said before, the threat of the nuclear weapon use is extremely useful to the Kremlin.
No, definitely. And we've heard this earlier as well. This is not the first time that this kind of nuclear stance has been taken by Russia. And at this point, we can almost expect something of this nature to come in. But these kind of changes which are being introduced into the nuclear doctrine, I think it is a louder message to the West that, we warned you well in advance, we've warned you enough, we're warning you again, now it's in our doctrine, so we're entitled to do it as well. We're telling you again and again, please back off. At this point, Ben, as per the Deputy Chairman of Russia's Security Council, Dmitry Medvedev, the nuclear doctrine review may help to cool down heads of some of the adversaries. Now, this is what he said. As per Zelensky, Russia will be pushed into diplomatic peace if the West strengthens Ukraine's position. So from both sides, it seemed to be, it seems as if they're both hinting at the fact that they are going to pressure the other one into peace. Do you feel a show of strength is the way to achieve peace with a country like Russia? Do you feel the West is taking the right stance at this point by entertaining Zelensky's remarks such as these?
Well, look at the timing of this. I mean, for this threat, the diplomatic, tool that it is in order to restrain America's support for Ukraine, you need to rattle the nuclear saber regularly. And at the moment, look, the UN General Assembly is going on, and Zelensky is in New York and met with Biden yesterday with a shopping list of weapons that he would like and permissions that he would like. And suddenly here is Putin rattling very loudly his nuclear saber. I mean, the timing is key, and it's obvious that it's a reminder to the West. And the goal here, I mean, they're not planning to strike Ukraine with a nuclear bomb. The goal here is to remind everybody of this threat and to depress or undermine Zelensky's calls on the states to up its support and give it, considerably more support in his so-called victory plan. And I think the rattling of the saber is actually going to work because the press coming out of the meeting that was yesterday is that, Zelensky's star is faded, that he hasn't had the warm reception he had a year ago. And that the Americans, particularly Republicans, are very reluctant to continue to fund Ukraine. And to this extent, Putin's his diplomatic move here of rattling the saber is working. It seems to be working rather well. And that Zelensky is going to leave New York with none of the things that he's asked for, at a time when things are going increasingly badly on the battlefield, at a time when Ukraine is already running out of money and the funding looks like it's going to fade away from this point on.
Ben, I think personally, I feel Zelensky, if one thing he would be really praying for at this point is that Kamala Harris wins this election, because the reception he's received from Trump during his trip. Trump initially said, I don't want to meet you, and then later said, okay, fine, I'll meet you, and then also gave him a hearing for not getting into talks with Russia and achieving any kind of peace. You mentioned the victory plan. We only heard a little bit about it from a tweet that, of course, came from Zelensky. What do you reckon the victory plan entails that he's discussed with Biden?
Well, they've leaked a few things. An accelerated membership of NATO's on the list. Clearly, more weapons and money is on the list, although details haven't been released. But again, comments from European and American diplomats who have seen the list or talked to the Ukrainians about it say it's basically the same list that he's had from the beginning. I mean, the demands for things like F-16s and more tanks and more missiles have been constant from the first week of the war, and they've been dribbled into Ukraine. And one comment said, look, it's the same list that we've been looking at for 2 years, just rehashed and repackaged. So I don't think there's going to be any surprises there. Put it this way, there's no clever strategic plan to, launch a sabotage attack on Russian infrastructure in order to collapse the economy. There's nothing new like that. It's the same old strategy as before. It's just give us more powerful weapons, give us more of them, and we will take the fight into Russia and destroy the oil refineries and try and undermine the Russian economy there by going after its ability to make money. As for the response, I mean, as I said, if you don't take the possibility of an actual nuclear strike that serious, then there isn't a need to have a strong response other than a rhetorical response. And I think we will see that, and it unsettles everybody. But I don't think we're actually going to see any real changes, because in terms of commitment, in terms of the US policy towards Ukraine of giving some but not enough weapons, because I don't think anybody at this point actually thinks there's going to be a nuclear attack. I mean, the thing to look out for here, when it starts to get really serious, is if Russia it does a nuclear test, if it explodes a big nuclear bomb, over the wilderness in Siberia, then that would be a very significant escalation. That would be like, we actually moved a concrete step towards the possibility of a nuclear strike. And that's clearly the first thing that they will do. And we're still far away. And Putin was asked specifically about undoing the nuclear test ban commitment that Russia's made. And the Kremlin hasn't commented on that, but there's no plans to do a test. And if that changes, then that's a sign that we should all be very worried.
Absolutely. And at this point, as far as that victory plan is concerned, from Zelensky, from the details which have surfaced, it seems more like a sustainability plan or a repackaged plea for more arms so that they can continue the fight. We will be waiting for more details on that to surface and become public. But thank you so much for sharing all your insights and, all your thoughts from your deep study into affairs concerning Russia and how it tackles, of course, warning against a nuclear attack and actually, carrying out one are two very different things, but one would hope that these warnings have some certain kind of effect and it cools down tensions, which are only brewing at this point as both sides seem aggressive in their stance. Peace talks seem out of the window, at least ever since the Kursk invasion. But thank you so much for joining us, Ben. That was Ben Aris, founder and editor-in-chief of BNE IntelliNews and former Moscow bureau chief for the Daily Telegraph. Pleasure speaking with you.
A pleasure.